Folks, so I'm going to talk today about ethics, and as today's practical lesson, we're going to come back and look at this again. I think if you had a chance to read the slide, the president of Stanford has just stepped down because there was basically fake data in several papers that he was the lead, the corresponding, basically papers from his group with his name on it contained fake data. And we'll talk in more detail about the details of this thing, but you can kind of get a sense of, even if you're too busy to fake the data yourself and you get someone else to fake the data for you, there are consequences. And that's a little bit of this discussion of unhealthy lab dynamics. So when we kind of talk about ethics, some of the things we'll be thinking about, are, well, what leads to this in the system, and what are the kind of the red flags to look out for. Okay. Sorry, this is okay, good. The clicker is working again. So we'll get into formal legal definitions under federal rules of what I mean by ethics, but this is a pretty good working definition, right? Because as a scientist, a lot of what you do and tell us is based on trust, right? It's very difficult for the journal to go back and check that everything you said is true when you submit a paper to a journal, right? It's usually the consequences for doing things wrong or doing things bad are not immediate. They will happen, but sometimes it can take years to happen. So until then, we're trusting you. And it turns out, Paul was using this quote for years, Paul McEwen, who I will sort of my partner on this talk, and eventually we've given this talk at a lot of REU things, and Melanie at CNF actually dug up the exact origin of the quote. Let's see if I can get that to display correctly. So, right, if you're wondering who this guy is, American author and philosopher, and there's a second half to this thing here, even when doing the wrong thing is legal. And that's an important bit. Particularly if you're a physicist or a scientist in industry, there are parts of your company that will be looking to take shortcuts because it's not illegal. It'll have horrible consequences down the road and was a bad thing to do, but hey, if your bonus depends on what happens this quarter, and then you plan to be moving company to your next position, what do you care? We're in it for the long haul, and so we actually care about these things. So there's a lot of, before I get into concrete examples, which will make this a lot more practical, people kind of think about just sort of laying out all the aspects of, what are the things that we worry about in order to do things ethically, and where are the conflict points going to be, right? So some of these points seem to be fairly obvious, and we'll talk a little about some of the tensions that can come about that cause people to do bad things. Obviously, you want to strive for scientific honesty. Carefulness and not making careless mistakes, right? That honest errors can happen, and making sure that things are right, you want to be careful that you got it right in the first place. Right? I mean, you might think, okay, what I do in my lab has no consequence or effect. We've just been through the whole COVID epidemic, and there were people early on who, made claims without proper care, or in some cases, with Didier Raoult's group in France, deliberate fraud, and how that impacted So the hydroxychloroquine and the ivermectin nonsense is based on, turns out it's not just careless work, it's based on fraudulent work. And it got into the mainstream media in ways that are still incredibly damaging today. There also is a lot of carelessness that was happening as, physicists were like, hey, I suddenly, know everything, so I'm going to study, random chemical in a beaker, and yep, Clorox successfully killed the virus, therefore we should be taking Clorox. I'm exaggerating slightly, but only slightly from how some of my colleagues behaved. At the same time, in addition to being very careful about what you want to do, having the freedom to chase the ideas that you think are important is an important one. One of the ways that's an important check on what you're doing is the idea of openness of your research, right? And that's become, in many areas, that's led to the movement of open access, the sharing of scientific data. If you want to publish in Science or Nature today, very strong pressure from the editors that you made available not only your raw data, but all of your code that took your raw data and turned it into a published figure. So someone else can take that and do exactly the same thing. And what's very interesting is the astronomy community are really the first that got into this whole idea of data sharing. It's now working its way throughout most of the federal agencies with actually some directives from the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So it's being formalized in. Some of the newest NSF grants actually require it, the DEMREFs, for instance, with the principle that your data has to be findable, accessible, reproducible. I forgot what the I stands for. Interoperable, that's what I thought, yeah. So that other people can play with your data and do things with it. In astronomy, this was important because you got to observe a supernova because that was your day on the telescope, but a lot of other people might want to analyze it as well. And the very interesting thing happened when the astronomers started to do this. They found a very significant amount of the time people had made careless mistakes, little coding errors in the code, things like that. And actually having multiple people being able to access the same data set helped you fix up the bugs and improve the codes. So you got better science in the end. We've been sharing microscopy data, some of which has had 500 downloads, 1,000 downloads, and people use our data to benchmark algorithms and see how their algorithm does compared to ours. If you're going to do this openness and sharing data, being able to, you're relying that when you're using this work, you're accounting that other people are going to give you credit for that. Otherwise, you put the stuff out there, they take and say, hey, look what I discovered. Then the whole openness thing falls apart. So a huge amount of science, the difference between scholarship and plagiarism is citation, right? That when you do something and you found someone's work useful, you should be mentioning where you got it from. And that's absolutely essential for having an open scientific discussion and being able to share things. And then the last one, reporting your research, obviously, again, COVID is a huge illustration for this first part. But the second one is, when to report it, when, there's a lot of unhappiness when people put a preprint up on archive and then suddenly get a press release on that thing when it hasn't necessarily been carefully peer reviewed. And then you suddenly are reading, hey, the age of the universe is 27 billion years and not 14 billion, just because someone said something crazy on archive a couple of days ago. That's an actual example. And never mind crazy astronomers who think they see UFOs. What I'm going to talk about today is a good practical example of how things can go wrong And this is based on, my experiences and Paul McEwen's experiences. Paul was faculty here at Cornell and has just retired effectively beginning of this month officially. But we'll talk a little bit about this. It's a case that a lot of the points in this case are still relevant today. To give you an idea of what's going on, this is Hendrick Schoen. Anyone recognize this guy? And Don Werder, who was with me at Bell, retired about 2 years ago. He eventually moved to Cornell as well. So I had a very up close and personal view of what happened and what went wrong. So a couple of things we should be talking about here. This all happened at Bell Labs. And if you kind of worked for Steve Seibner, you've probably heard all about Bell Labs. If you've worked for Melissa, you've probably heard all about Bell Labs because they got to postdoc there. Bell Labs, pretty famous place. What did Alexander Graham Bell do? Yeah. So he started Atlantic Telephone and Telegraph. That was his telephone company. It grew into a monopoly. They built the hardware for telephones. That was Western Electric, and that was their manufacturing and development arm. And so Bell Labs was the research arm of this giant telephone monopoly that had, it controlled the telephones in the US, in Canada as well. If you're wondering, why is it that Canada has an area code in the US system? It's because it was built out as part of this same telephone network. And the research done at Bell Labs, you can see over here, 7 Nobel Prizes, 13 Nobel laureates. They had a little museum out the front. This experiment over here is the Davidson-Gomer experiment, for which Davidson and Gomer won the 1927 Nobel Prize. This is the experiment that was basically proved electrons were waves. They didn't set out to prove that. It was an accident. They were actually trying to build vacuum tubes as amplifiers and diodes, and they were firing electron beams at a surface to figure out the efficiency of the system. So doing experiments that kind of made you feel a little bit like some of the things in the photocathode group. And this experiment later would, you'd recognize as a very, very early Reed experiment, or maybe LEAD is a better way to describe it. This is the world's first communication satellite, or at least the backup of it, Telstar. That's me, a little dark in the photo. Obvious other things invented at Bell Labs: the transistor, the laser, CCD camera, the solar cell, Unix, C, and C++. The folks who had invented Unix and C were still around when I was there, and having got to meet them, I understand a lot more about why the syntax of C is as obfuscated as it is. Ken Thompson was a very interesting character. If you go back a little further, Shannon and his information theory, his logbooks were still in the library at Bell, and Nyquist of Nyquist sampling, Bell Labs as well. The idea of negative feedback is an early Bell Labs patent. So very, very strong tradition of invention. I've actually left out things like the discovery of the 4K blackbody radiation, that little echo of the Big Bang. A lot of stuff. So, at its peak, maybe over 1,000 PhD scientists working at Bell Labs doing research. So So let's sort of talk about a little bit of, what had kind of happened there and why it led to the environment that enabled bad things to happen. So let's talk about my colleague, Jan Hendrik Schön. He was in I was working in the materials physics group at Bell Labs, about 15 people in the group. Our department head originally was Bertram Batlog, and Schoen was originally hired as a postdoc to work in the group, and I had to go back and look at my notes to figure out when exactly this guy started, because he was really quiet, kept to himself, didn't say a lot. And Batlog told me what he had hired him to work on, and my initial reaction was, well, that's nuts, that's never going to work. But the idea was, if we go back 20 years ago, there was a lot of stuff happening on semiconductor-based nanotechnologies at the time, right? And the most simple, obvious application of that was transistors were scaling down from things that before that were made with optical lithographies and were quarter micron dimension in size. And we were working on things that were like, hey, let's build a 50 nanometer transistor. These things went into production about a decade later. Today, these dimensions are down to about 20 nanometers, and the designs are much more elaborate, so their effective performance looks like that of a 3 nanometer device. But down at the nanoscale, you could make things on the scale of tens of nanometers, and they would do interesting things. And so the other kind of nanotechnology that people were starting to think about was an organic nanotechnology, which is inspired by nature, right? I mean, DNA does amazing things. It's a charged molecule. There are all these wonderful membranes that let ions through, and the sort of thing that people wanted to do at the time was, well, could we get all the kind of wonderful stuff in the transistory behavior and lasers and stuff we made out of silicon with expensive lithographies, could we do the same thing with organic molecules? And, what did we sort of have at the time? If you rolled up your sheets of carbon, you'd get nanotubes. Oddly enough, people weren't yet playing with graphene as an electronic thing yet, even though electron microscopists had been making graphene since the 1960s with Scotch tape. But the kind of things that people were getting excited about then was, hey, I can take a carbon nanotube and I can wire it up to contacts and put molecules on it, and maybe I can make electronics that way. And their properties were interesting. So Schoen was kind of brought in to do this sort of molecular electronics. And cutting a long story short, he'd had a spectacular run of amazing claims about molecular electronics. This one in particular, even though I'm going to slightly out of chronological order, this one in particular was a very impactful paper. So this is 2001. He's been at Bell Labs for about 2 years now. And this is what he called a SAMFET, self-assembled monolayer field effect transistor. The idea was you put down a gold contact, you put down a thiol molecule, the little sulfur at the end sticks to the gold. Everything arranges beautifully like that, vertically, put another gold contact on the top of that, and now I can start to send my electrons through the gold. I can apply an electric field to this thing from the SiO on the silicon substrate through the silicon as a gate oxide, and now I can modulate the conductance of this material. And here are some beautiful IV curves that look like classical field effect transistor behavior. There's your subthreshold slope, there's your saturation. This is giving you amazing transistor performance, and the device was in fact very simple to make. It didn't require any fancy lithography. It's just a shadow mask on the corner of the thing. and the turn-on voltage, the gate modulation, factor at 10 to the 5 between on and off state. Very, very impressive performance. In fact, better than what you could do with silicon. This stuff got enormous press. Picked up by the BBC, picked up by even like late night talk shows were talking about it and making jokes about how you could make cell phones so tiny you could accidentally swallow them. Here's sort of the press release. And the timing is interesting because 1997 was the 50th anniversary of the transistor invented at Bell Labs. And so here we are, a little over 50 years later, and here could well be the next technology to displace the silicon technology. Now, Schoen had more success than just that. This is a, here's the picture of Schoen and his collaborator on that project, Jan Hendrik Schön. Here again is you take the plastic, you grow a very perfect crystal. Christian Klock was our crystal grower, grew beautiful organic crystals. And then if you put a metal contact and a little gate oxide as an insulator on the organic materials, you have to put an aluminum oxide, then a metal on top of that, and apply an electric field, you can pull a huge number of carriers into the plastic. And over here, at a sufficiently high carrier density, so low carrier density, this thing is behaving like a semiconductor. High carrier density, the resistance has gone to 0 at low temperature. We have a superconducting plastic. First superconducting plastic. Pretty amazing stuff. Things got even better than that. Here is an electrically pumped organic laser. So you've got your electronics is made all out of organic material. You apply an apply a voltage to this thing, and it lasers. So here is the press release pointing out the team effort with Schoen and all his collaborators. Ananth is the laser expert. This was another paper in Nature. So pretty spectacular stuff. With this amazing track record of things, by the end of 2001, Science magazine named that little molecular FET the breakthrough of the year. The work was going spectacularly well. Schoen was turning out one paper every 8 days in 2001. He had 25 co-authors on his work. He had 6 patent filings, and he was winning international awards. Braunschweig Prize from the city of Braunschweig was $50,000 each to each of the prize winners. So it's awarded to Schoen, to Batlogg, and to Christian Klock. He'd won the MRS Young Investigator Award, which is sort of, I think, young scientist under 40. Again, very, very, very good feather in his cap. If you actually remember, Nobel Prize in 2001 ended up going for some early work on the electrically conducting organic molecules, polyacetylene. So that was much earlier work. So often when you're going to give someone a Nobel Prize, you have to make sure the prior work in the field is recognized as well. And it certainly felt like in 2001 they were clearing out the prior work in the field to set up for a Nobel Prize in this area. It was certainly important for Bell Labs. Bell Labs at this point was part of Lucent Technologies. I think students probably, you haven't heard of Lucent. Faculty, how many of you owned Lucent stock? How many of you still own anything related to Lucent stock? There's nothing left. It was the spin-off of the hardware side of AT&T. It at one point was a company that, its annual revenue was bigger than the GDP of Pakistan. And we think at one point it had more nuclear scientists than Pakistan. But by 2001, it was in financial trouble. And so when it came to Lucent's annual report to the shareholders, they didn't have a lot to report on good news with the product, but they certainly could point to some highlights of technology in the pipeline that would be great. And so page 3 of the report, page 2 is like the index. Well, page 1 was the index, page 2 was the half of the letter from the CEO of the company as to why he shouldn't get fired. But the next thing was, highlighting how Hendrick Schoen and Janan have fabricated molecular scale organic transistors. And I'm going to say fabricate was an unfortunate but accurate choice of words. So, like I said, company was not doing well. In fact, this was basically what the stock price was doing. Yeah, there were other problems in the company if you kind of look at these headlines. So one of the problems of the company in turmoil is whenever things go bad in a company, the solution is to restructure. So what sets part of the scene of what I'm about to tell you is that the company was restructuring literally almost every month. And so our groups were reorganized every time a department head at Bell thought something was going on that was a little bit worrying. They were reassigned to another department. So Schoen, in this time period, went through 5 different managers and was sort of, each manager was only keeping an eye on him for about a month or 2, and then we'll see that caused problems. Nevertheless, things were proceeding well for Schoen. Here, for instance, he's winning the Otto Klung Prize from the Free University of Berlin. This one, you kind of get a sense, even from the German without translation, where people were thinking things were going, right? And he's now gathered, when he receives the prize, he is surrounded by other Nobel laureates. I think folks in the room will probably, even from this terrible picture, recognize Horst Stormer, who at that point had just retired from Bell and taken a position at Columbia. So things were still looking pretty good in 2001. 2001 at Cornell, Paul McEwen had just moved to Cornell from Berkeley, and he was doing work on nanoelectronics, and with Dan Ralph and Tito Brugna, they were like, trying to make gold contacts to send current through single molecules. It was nice, but nothing in terms of properties to write home about compared to what Schoen was doing. And so 2001, Cornell wrote a center proposal for what became our Center for Nanoscale Science. And, what Paul was very good at the sort of nanotube kind of stuff, but it was very clear whatever he was doing in nanotubes was just grossly outperformed by what Schoen was reporting. So this is actually a slide from his presentation to the National Science Foundation of, hey, Cornell, we've got good track records in these things, but this is the next thing, this is the next big thing, this is what Cornell wants to study. I was still at Bell Labs at the time. I was on the external advisory board when this thing got funded. But certainly Paul was excited to do the stuff because of the success seen by Schoen. And in fact, the proposal was funded. And Paul's students started to work on this. And he couldn't reproduce any of the results. And he wasn't the only one who couldn't reproduce these results. Pretty much everyone else couldn't reproduce these results. Batlogg, who was Schoen's boss, had at this point retired from Bell Labs. He'd moved to ETH Zurich. He'd set up his own group independently as Schoen, and his students were just stupid. They were just no good in the lab. They couldn't get the same results that Schoen got. So Schoen had had spectacular results for like 2 years now. 2002, we go into now 3 years, and other people are not able to reproduce the results internally or externally. And 2002, my friend Julia Xu and her postdoc Lin Lu one day went into our patent attorney's office at Bell and to talk about a patent with the patent attorney. And sitting on his desk were a large number of Schoen patents, just sort of kind of lying out there. And during this conversation, the phone rang, the lawyer stood up to take the phone call. Julia was left staring at these pictures of Schoen's that were upside down on the desk. And when she did that, she noticed something. She noticed that 2 patents on 2 different projects for 2 different materials had identical curves. So here's a zoom up on the 2 curves. Here are the 2 papers. They are for 2 very different organic devices. You can just see from the device structure, the IV curve measured should be for some very different set of organic electronics. You can see the voltage range on the 2 curves are completely different. But if you look very carefully at the noise patterns, I thought I'd animated that one in, you can recognize some common features in the noise. Now, universal scaling relationship of a curve overall, you can blame on physics, but you can't tell me that I get exactly the same noise measurement in 2 different curves over 2 different voltage ranges, and that came about in a clean and honest way. Some of our management people were trying to believe that very hard, but you know, anyone who actually had been in a lab would know this is not good. So there's a long story of this wasn't the first time we'd found bad things happening internally. We'd previously found some other bad things and reported that to Schoen's boss. And Schoen's boss of the day or the boss of the month, you know, their response is anytime you kind of find someone doing something bad, you don't want to immediately believe that the person you're working with is a crook. So his boss was, you know, contacted Hendrick and said, you've got something really weird going on with your data. Could you please sort this out? And Schoen, of course, obliged, and the problem went away. So there was, at this point, some very low confidence in the management. And so what happened was, through a fairly complicated chain of events, you know, certainly people in the company knew about this. Eventually, Bob Willett, who ironically is the last scientist left at Bell Labs, even today, he's still there. Bob actually called up a colleague at Princeton, and she, you know, who was someone who was also trying to reproduce this stuff and having no luck, and tipped them off to go take a look at some of these curves. And so she and Paul McEwen kind of sat down and pulled out all of Hendrick's papers, because it was a fairly, you know, vague tip. So they had to go and look at all of Hendrick's papers to see which one had the duplicate curve in it. And what was surprising was they didn't just find this one. When they took a careful look, they found dozens of papers with duplicate curves in them. So here's another one. This is P-channel device going from 0 to minus 10 volts. Another paper, 0 to plus 10 volts. This is N-channel. So electron conduction, hole conduction. Let's go back and flash back and forth between the boom, 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 right? Look at that. Okay, let's go back. Let's take a look at the superconducting plastic. There's the one that went magically superconducting. By the way, when you worked out the electric field that had to be applied to get that carrier density that he claimed, was a suspiciously high electric field. Aluminum oxide typically has a breakdown at 6 megavolts per centimeter. He was claiming his stuff could break down at over 10 to 20. Let's look at those 2 curves a little more carefully. Oh, look at those wiggles. It looks kind of weird that those 2 curves are the same, and then it suddenly superconducts so abruptly, like anyone had just set all those data points to 0 by hand. right? The patterns I'm showing you here, this was sort of maybe things were now digital enough that people were kind of learning to do these tricks for the first time. But today, you know, this is almost a routine strategy of things to look for and check for. So I want to kind of point out that if you want to follow this kind of stuff today, Elizabeth Bick is someone who kind of has made a business, or at least a full-time hobby, at this point I'd say it's a business, out of looking at papers, particularly in biology, and looking for duplicate parts of the image. And then she'll post them on Twitter, or at least when Twitter was still a little more functional. And you know, got very good at calling out thousands and thousands of faked images. And in fact, she called out very early on the fake hydroxychloroquine and the fake ivermectin papers out of the group at Mosai. So, you know, yeah, if people had been paying a little bit more attention, they wouldn't be, you know, yeah, feeding themselves horse dewormer. So, you know, I'll come back to this sort of, people got a little bit, you know, the practice of how to look for this misconduct. Okay, what did Bell do, right? So Paul McEwen, and he's, you know, he's a senior guy, he's tenured, he can kind of afford to take a little more risks. Lydia Sohn was someone up for tenure at Princeton and actually did not get tenure because she'd put all her effort into trying to reproduce Schoen's work and was getting nowhere. So she was leaving Princeton. She actually was luckily enough, she got hired at Berkeley a little later, and I'll explain why she got hired. But basically what happened was, you know, she and Paul wrote up a letter, one letter to Nature, one letter to Science, pointing out duplicate curves in Science and Nature papers. They contacted Bell Labs management and said, hey, there's a problem. And Schoen's manager at the time, who is now a very well-established chemist at Northwestern, said, no, there's no problem, don't worry about it. And McEwen's like, no, I'm not here to argue with you. I'm just giving you the courtesy of letting you know that this letter and our comment will be appearing in Nature this Friday. You can do with that what you want. So at that point, you know, Bell management had been thinking, and people had been worried, but everyone of Schoen's managers, every time they got worried, they got moved to a new group. Schoen was clearly a problem, but he wasn't their problem anymore. It was someone else's problem. And the next person had to kind of start from scratch and figure it out again from scratch. So anyway, at this point, that call from Paul escalated things enough that after exploring all other alternatives for 2 years, Bell finally decided to do the right thing. So now what they did was they set up an external committee to investigate all the papers. And this actually has become a model for investigations since then. And I'll talk about exactly why. But they did, amazingly, because up until this point, there really wasn't, you know, any standardized practices or anything like that. But they actually got a lot of things right. So they got an external panel, so no conflict of interest. They actually interviewed all of the co-authors. We'll come into actually more things that they did was right. There were a couple of things the panel was not allowed to look at. They were not allowed to ask what did management know and when did they know it, because a lot of those managers, well, they got to set up the rules, and the company was in trouble and they were about to get jobs at universities and didn't want that to get messed up. They didn't want to look at patents because, well, they would tell you, well, patents are, you know, company property, but also maybe some names were on those patents. And there are legal consequences for fraudulent patent filings. Nevertheless, at least in terms of the science, they had complete openness to interview everyone involved. And I'll point out, remember I talked about Stanford on the very first slide? This one was not quite true. So what happened was, you know, basically same day that McEwen's letter appears in Science and Nature, They're also able to put out a press release in Science and Nature that Bell Labs has actually launched an investigation to look into all these data duplications. This is a picture of Schoen. We had another group going away thing. I think this was on the Friday and our luncheon was on the Monday. He's looking really shocked, absolutely devastated. Clark, this is a collaborator, Clark, he's pretty happy. Now, Friday investigation gets started. Monday morning, Schoen shows up in my office. For 2 years, I've been trying to get a sample from Schoen to understand why his aluminum oxide had magical breakdown properties and no one else at the company did. You have to understand, at the time we were looking at alternative gate dielectrics for transistors. One of the candidate materials was aluminum oxide. We had an entire group studying aluminum oxide to apply high electric fields, and it broke down at much lower field. So for 2 years, I'd been asking Schoen, hey, could I get one of your samples? And the excuses were, oh, my samples are in Germany. Oh, my samples got confiscated by customs. The excuses got more and more bizarre, but I'd never got a sample from him. That Monday, he shows up in my office with his sample of the magic gate oxide. And he says, I have a sample of the gate oxide for you, but I was very naughty. I didn't write down whether it was a good one or a bad one. But I'll go back and look up in my notes, and I'm sure after you've measured it and checked it all out, I'll be able to tell you whether it was a good one or a bad one. So I just was like, okay, what do you know about the sample? Please, tell me. He says, well, this is a 30 nanometer thick aluminum oxide, and he's grown it on a molybdenum oxide metal layer on the back of a glass slide. So I just take a look at the thing by eye, and I see interference fringes. And I count 1, 2, 3 interference fringes. You can see them by eye. How thick do you think this sample is if I can see 3 interference fringes in it? So double that, because I go in and I come out. Right, the metal on the bottom, so it's double the, it's a half, yeah, but, so, roughly by eye, I would have guessed this was about 500 nanometers. This guy, who's supposed to be the absolute master grower guy, who grows this magic material, says 30 nanometers, but doesn't know about interference fringes. I mean, this is not good news. So, we obligingly take this thing and we put it in our electron microscope, cross-section it. You can measure the thickness. That's a half micron scale bar. It's about 450 nanometers. I've cut out some slides, but after I cut it up, I still had a lot left over. I went down to my friend Bruce Van Dover, who is doing dielectric breakdown measurements. We did dielectric breakdown. It blew up at about 5 megavolts per centimeter. So it wasn't even a particularly good aluminum oxide gate dielectric. So at least I knew physically there was nothing there. And if this guy was a decent scientist, he would have known, basic thin film facts, which he didn't know. Okay, so now we get into a little bit of the formal definitions, because this is about what's to come up. And what is the definition of misconduct? Right? It's a civil finding. So let's go into this. Fabrication, falsification of or plagiarism. Fabrication is just made stuff up. There was nothing there. Falsification is you had some original data and you changed it. You moved the data points around in a way that were not kosher. And plagiarism is, well, you stole something from someone else, right? And you didn't give them credit for it. And making stuff up stealing stuff, in proposing research, performing research, or reviewing research, or reporting the research results is all misconduct, right? So if you write a fellowship application, like an NSF fellowship application, and there's fake stuff in there, that's misconduct. If you steal ideas when you're reviewing a paper, that's plagiarism, right? So what it does not include is honest errors and differences of opinion, right? So if someone claims something and they got it wrong because you think they're an idiot, that's not misconduct in of itself, right? Just because you disagree with things, or they made a careless mistake, or they did something in the measurement that was wrong, but you can kind of see how you got to that through a well-intentioned process. That's not misconduct. In order to have a finding of misconduct, it's based on the preponderance of the evidence because it's a civil requirement, which means more likely than not that, yeah, that probably happened. You departed from what the field considers the acceptable practices. It's a little vague, but that's just, the basic, what's okay to do to data. I can't go and I can't edit part of an image. You can kind of find the requirements that for submitting a Science or Nature paper, what you're allowed to do in image to an image. The important part here is that it be done knowingly, intentionally, or recklessly. Knowing and intentional, I think, are fairly obvious that the person meant to do that. That's a mental state. It's very hard to prove that someone knew what they were doing was wrong unless they go on Twitter and tweet it out. Most cases, how you would determine something was intentional is when you go back and you have the investigation of the stuff, and then they lie to you and give you new fake data, right? Then you go, okay, this is not an accident. This is a repeated pattern of things. So that's sort of how you might determine intent. I mention that because this is going to come up in a couple of days, maybe when we hear from our room temperature superconductor guy again. But recklessness is usually sort of the way you would reach this finding, right? Recklessness is, they should have known better. It doesn't, it could be they were warned repeatedly, don't do this. But it also could be you should have known as a scientist that this was a significant departure from what you were taught, and you shouldn't have been doing that, right? Often if an investigation goes wrong, what people would say is, yeah, all this stuff happened, but they didn't know better. And that usually was a failure to understand the recklessness standard. And I mention this because about half almost of academic misconduct investigations, according to at least NIH, are mishandled. And in many cases, the point where the investigation fails is the failure to understand what was meant by reckless. So in many cases, they look and go, oh yeah, this guy did lots of stupid mistakes. He threw away data points he shouldn't have thrown away, but he didn't know any better. And it's like, no, unless there's something very wrong with your department, he should have known better. Okay, so keeping in mind these kind of requirements, what happened to Mr. Schoen? Well, it took a long time from May to September to work through interviewing everyone and pinning everything down. And you can imagine, if you want to do this properly, you got to get everyone on the written record and then cross-check things, right? And see if the stories stay consistent. So here's the amazing. This is an amazing report to read. It's worth reading. What it finds is that, and I'm quoting over here, one scientist committed scientific misconduct. This guy. 19 others were cleared, or I should rather, and we can talk a little bit about exactly what that meant, and that's worth understanding. So what did we find out? Only Schoen made the devices. No co-author on those papers ever witnessed an experiment? Stop and think about that for a minute. He made an organic laser, apparently, that emitted light in the visible. He was on a paper with a laser expert whose expertise was supposed to be measuring lasers. That guy was on the paper, in several cases wanted to give the invited talks about the laser work, and now he's saying, I never saw it laser, I never saw an experiment. I just saw the curves that Hendrick had measured. It's like, Hendrick has no training in measuring lasers. What were you thinking? No laboratory records were kept. Apparently. I mean, if you never did the experiment, I understand why no records were kept. The original data he claims was deleted from his computers because he didn't have enough storage space. I had the same boss this guy had. I generate huge amounts of data. Whenever I wanted more storage space, I would get it. When I wanted faster computers, I would get it, and I would donate my old computer to my office mate, Harold Wong, who would get all my hand-downs, and he would use my old computer, and I would get the new fancy computer with a whole bunch of hard drives all stacked up. If he had ever wanted storage space, he could have got it. So I don't even believe that excuse. So there's a lot more details. It's an amazing report to read. I don't know if they might have changed the link on this thing, but if you like Google Schoen report, Schoen investigation, American Physical Society, the full report is up there in detail and makes an absolutely fascinating read. And in fact, is a how-to manual of how to go about one of these investigations. It is still kind of almost literally the gold standard to how to do these things, because it's one of the very, very, very few reports on misconduct that's actually been made public. A lot of universities and national labs, when they have a misconduct investigation, it's viewed as a personnel matter, and personnel matters are confidential, and so they never release the report. And so you never get to know the ins and outs of what went on and what went wrong, unless they chose to do it voluntary, of which about the only example is this one, or your university messes up so badly that you start to get letters from Congress saying, we pay for your money, please turn over your findings of your investigation to us. And then Congress chooses to publish this in the congressional record, along with a note saying, we hope your next investigation is one worthy of a research institution. That was Purdue that got into this trouble. And as a result of that, Purdue ended up getting a new vice provost and a new president. And came to a more sensible conclusion in the investigation as well. Okay, so really bad stuff. Well, what happened? All of the papers were retracted. And so you can look up these papers, and they all have a little retraction notice on them. And that retraction notice, sort of says, yeah, bad things happened. Based on the preponderance of the evidence, Schoen committed scientific misconduct as defined by falsification, fabrication of data, and the research is not accurately represented in the research record. And you'll notice that all of the co-authors of the letter, with the exception of Schoen himself, agreed to the retraction. Until this point, it was kind of agreed that if you wanted to retract a paper, everyone had to agree to the retraction. In this case, there's one guy who didn't want to do that. And they're like, well, I guess we're going to have to change our rules. What's very interesting is, if you think about what happened, there were a lot of complaints at the journals before this, but nothing happened. What the journal relies on or relied on was that the institution took action before they would do anything. So, what happened to Schoen? Well, obviously he was fired. I should tell you, interestingly enough, what he was officially fired for was failing to keep records. right? You are required as your, part of your contract of employment at Bell was you have to maintain records of everything you did, because if there was ever a patent dispute, your notebook is the legal document that we would base things on to deal with any intellectual property disputes. And that he had failed to do that, or at least failed to show any evidence that he had done it, maybe he had destroyed things, was a grounds for firing. And it was a ground for firing that was indisputable. They were worried, in fact, that he would try to sue them and challenge the misconduct finding. And say, no, this wasn't misconduct, and let's go try it in court, and it could drag on for years with frivolous lawsuits. But what was absolutely indisputable was there were no records. So that was an easy firing thing. He left Bell Labs in disgrace, and 2 years later, University of Constance decided to revoke his degree. I'll come back to this in a bit, because he ended up challenging it in court, and maybe about 6 years later got the degree back. And that was a mistake, because the University of Constance said, we are taking away his degree because he has brought disrepute on the university. But when he was a student at the university, nothing was a problem. He only went bad when he went to Bell Labs and was lured by this expensive American system. A couple of slides from now, I will show you something that this was absolutely not true. And the University of Constance missed an opportunity to set the record straight. Okay, so let's start to think a little bit about what we learned. 25 co-authors. Only one person ever saw the experiment. So how did it get this far? How did it get to the point that this guy was kind of in the running for a Nobel Prize in a short time? How did things go wrong? So who's at fault? I mean, obviously, we know if he hadn't faked data, none of this would have happened, right? So that's certainly one part of the story. What about the co-author? What about all the co-workers? What is their responsibility in that? Anyone want to take some guess at that? Think, knowing what you know now.
I mean, I don't know about the like legally responsible in terms of like fraud, but I feel like if I had known someone who had been worked with somebody who committed fraud, scientific fraud on that level, I would certainly feel like kind of reluctant to trust them as well, just from a intuitive level, I think.
So that's certainly the case. What's a little more complicated here is, some of these things are clear cut, right? The guy who's supposed to do the laser measurements says, oh no, I never did any laser measurements. You go, well, okay, why are you on the paper? Right? I think that's a pretty clear-cut case. There are other things that are a little more tricky, right? So Christian Klock grew beautiful organic crystals, but he's a crystal grower, right? He made beautiful crystals, and then he would give them to Schoen, and Schoen would take them away to his lab and come back with beautiful data. Klock is a synthetic chemist. He's not a physicist who knows much about high-TC superconductors. So the question you sort of would ask with, how much do you blame Christian for these things? He certainly, he supplied this crystal, but he didn't measure it. And, to some extent, I wouldn't expect him to be measuring it either. And to his credit, when people, said, I can't reproduce Hendrick's result, Christian would say, let me send you some of my crystals, and you can try work with those. So, in this case, I think he comes out of this thing maybe a little cleaner than some other people do. Janan grew the organic molecules for the SAMFET, but again, she's not a physicist. It turned out she tried to actually make some devices herself, and none of those devices worked at all in any way. And she was still trying to kind of pick out one out of 1,000 looked better than some of the others and say, look, this one's sort of working a bit. But again, you know, her expertise was making the molecules. It's a little harder, it's a little, you know, it's more of a gray area there. And at the time, there were no rules or guidance on this stuff. And so, you know, that was basically how all the co-authors got to walk away without too much, you know, dirt on them, was there was nothing in place. As a result of this, Science and Nature immediately introduced a policy of co-author responsibility. So if you now submit a paper to Science and Nature, thanks to this dude, and thanks to his co-workers, you actually have to fill out on Science a very long form claiming responsibility for which pieces of data are your data, which figures are your figure, which things did you actually produce, what part of the paper were you involved in, was it the intellectual part, was it the data analysis, literally all of the stuff. And you put a little statement in at the end of the paper after the acknowledgements, which is author contributions, saying who did what, right? So I was never on one of these papers because he'd never give me a sample. But, you know, today, had I been on a paper with him, there would be a line saying that, you know, David and his student did the electron microscopy of the sample. And, you know, the student did the microscopy, and I oversaw that the data for the microscopy was properly handled. And that kind of a statement is a really important thing to have, because if things go wrong, you can understand who did what and who needs to get blamed for it. There's a second part to this thing. How did so many people end up on those papers? Well, it turned out a lot of those people came into the problem with good intentions, and they would look at, Schoen would show them some internal result, and they'd look at it and say, that's not physical, that it can't possibly work this way, or, you know, that's not a good test of superconductivity, you'd have to go do something else, you'd want to do some microwave measurements or something like that. And Schoen would go away, and 2 weeks later he'd come back and say, look at this new result, it exactly agrees with what you had suggested. Without your help, I would never have thought to have done the experiment. Would you like to be a co-author on my paper? And so you know, this is how so many people got sucked in, is he had confirmed what they had wanted to see about the thing, and he told them that they had made an important contribution, and they would have been much better off with just being mentioned in the acknowledgements, right? So there's a thing of thinking about, you know, if you're only tangentially involved with the project and you don't really understand all the details, you may not want to sign on to it, and much better off being acknowledged. A lot of anger towards the managers, a lot of anger towards backlog. Interestingly enough, what most people didn't realize was everything blew up in 2002. Backlog had left the company in 1999. There were 4 other managers after that, and if I named them, you would recognize those names. Those are very well-known people today. The best I can say for defending the managers is none of them had the problem for a very long time, and once they got moved to their next rotating position, they lost interest in following up in something that was clearly very messy. And had they stuck with that a little bit longer, they probably would have unraveled things much earlier.
David, can you clarify something?
Mm-hmm.
Bertram was his postdoctoral advisor initially.
Yes.
So how long was he the postdoctoral advisor versus Schoen being a member of technical staff?
So I think so the transition to MTS was a little slower on paper than it was officially because of visa issues. But basically by '99, Backlog was out of the loop and Schoen was an independent MTS. And he was reporting to people that we know. Let's just leave it at that. And they were the ones who got to set up the investigation and decide who got looked into and who didn't. So some of our chemistry colleagues who are doing very well now in other places had a very large number of patents with Mr. Schoen. And every time they filed a patent, they got $1,000. And if the patent was awarded, they got another $1,000. And if you file 100 patents, you're doing pretty well. And some of these folks are known for filing lots of patents. So in some sense, he was an easy guy to blame. And part of that was self-inflicted because even though he was no longer responsible for Schoen, he was going around giving a lot of talks with Schoen's data. Right? So 1999, he was ETH. He had his own group. His own group wasn't getting much done, but he had all of the data that Schoen had sent him. I mean, if you look at it carefully, right, that the dividing line is he's not on the SAMFET paper, but he's on all the single crystal stuff. So the earlier things, yeah, he's a co-author because that was when he did it as a postdoc. The later stuff, which is the more bizarre things, where things escalated and collapsed very quickly because there was much less of a sanity check. Schoen was doing this independently. And, so that's why he's got co-authors on the paper. But it was interesting sort of when Batlogg showed me some of his early results, I was like, wait, this is nuts. How can that possibly be? And you ask, standard questions. So he had got very good mobility out of the organic material. And I'm like, it's an organic. Is this a band conductor or a hopping conduction? And Schoen had then, you can kind of literally see the checklist of questions that Batlogg had asked Schoen. And in response to every question, Schoen had produced a new piece of data that exactly addressed that question, but had done so in a sufficiently amateurish way that it then meant you had the next question to ask. So, when you looked at his evidence for band conduction, you're like, wait a minute, what's going on with the band gap here? Why is the band gap getting bigger as you go up in temperature? He'd answered things in a textbook fashion, but not realizing the subtleties that weren't discussed in the textbook. Journals published a hell of a lot of stuff in a very short time without going, hey, wait a minute, he's publishing a paper every 2 weeks. Every issue of Nature has one of Schoen's papers in it. What's going on here? More importantly, a lot of the reviewers were expressing concerns. And the reviewers were pointing out things that were unphysical, and the editors were ignoring that because they wanted to be the journal to have the next hot Schoen paper. And so when things blew up, people were like, I was the reviewer, this is what I wrote, and you still published it. The interesting thing here was, the journal said, well, look, we can't possibly conduct an investigation. We can't check everything out. We can just kind of check that things are at least internally consistent. We rely on our reviewers to do that. And that we rely on the institutions to conduct proper investigations. And I know of only one exception to that, but I hope it becomes a rule and not an exception. How many people have heard of the room temperature superconductor? Yeah, if you're at the APS March meeting, you're probably queuing to get into the room like my guys were, right? So that is an interesting example where if you dig into the details and you look at what's floating around on Twitter, it feels almost like the Schoen case all over again. Same kind of curve issues. The guy's thesis is rife with plagiarism of other people's work. The work he did as a postdoc has been retracted for duplicate and irregular curves. His first claim of superconductivity has been retracted for duplicate and irregular curves. He has another superconductivity paper out that people can point out duplicate and irregular curves, and it hasn't yet been retracted for some reason. But I just say wait. And he has another couple of papers, including one to PRL on another material, that PRL actually opened their own misconduct investigation. Because here we are, after 3 years of complaints to the university's just, his university hasn't found any evidence of misconduct. despite the manipulated curves, despite the plagiarism, they don't seem to be able to find their own shoelaces to tie. I don't know what's wrong with them. But I can tell you that very, very shortly, the results of that misconduct investigation conducted by Physical Review Letters, they got external reviewers to take a look at the data, request the original data from this group, and the group had trouble providing it and eventually provided something that turned out not to in any way resemble the data in the paper, which certainly looks like intent. And actually, in the draft statement that's going to come out in PRL, I don't know if the lawyers will let them do it, but they said, we have found, by preponderance of evidence, we found evidence of misconduct, and that's why we're retracting this paper. At that point, it will be very interesting to see what his university decides to do. And if they don't act, I'm very interested to see what the federal funding agencies do. But in general, the journals tend to say, we don't have the resources to conduct misconduct investigations. We rely on institutions to do that, and we rely on institutions to do an effective job of that. And just a reminder, about half the time they don't. Questions of how is the community supposed to react to these things while it's happening, right? Do you pretend it's not happening? Do you call it out? Right? I mean, and you can look at this room temperature superconductor case and try to figure out, how polite people are about dancing around the topic and how many people are willing to call it out for what it is. In Schoen's case, when people stood up in an audience, do you accuse the guy of fraud publicly? It's difficult. I mean, the people who did that were people who were known for being fairly cranky and obnoxious, and they had nothing to lose. So Bob Laughlin has a Nobel Prize and is known to be very obnoxious, felt completely liberated to call it out for what it is. Other people were much politer in that thing. In the case of the room temperature superconductor, the particularly cantankerous guy is Hirsch, and he was willing to call it out because, he has nothing to lose again. But certainly, if you're a young person in the field, whether you want to stand up and say things is a much harder thing to decide on, because there's a question of, does the person who's doing this thing have powerful friends who might retaliate? So a little bit of question over here is, what's the fallout for this thing? I mean, so where did this picture come from? Well, partly this was the movie at the time. This picture was actually made by backlog students at ETH, right? So these were the poor kids who had been pressured by their boss to reproduce Schoen's results and were unable to do so. And to their credit, despite complaining from their boss, were unable to do so. So they felt really vindicated. But if you think about what the fallout was, millions of dollars were wasted by other people trying to reproduce results that would never work, including us at Cornell. This was Paul's center, his CNS center, first couple of years. His group was going off on a wild goose chase. Paul's estimate was, way more than 40 PhD students and postdocs spent 2 to 3 years of their life trying and failing to get similar results. Right? If you're a postdoc and you spent 2 years on something, and at the end of the 2 years, you got nothing to show for it, that's not good, right? I should mention this because, at Princeton, Lydia Sonn had just been denied tenure because she'd spent 3 years trying to reproduce this and nothing was working. Lucky for her, the report came out just as she was applying to a job for a faculty position at Berkeley. So she got a position at Berkeley. Sherry Kagan was at IBM as a staff scientist trying to reproduce this stuff. It wasn't working. Luckily, the report came out in time that when she wanted to move to UPenn, she had now written up a very substantial paper showing none of these things were reproducible, and because the report had come out, it actually could get published. But certainly, derailing people's careers for 2 to 3 years, and particularly for postdocs, a very vulnerable time of their career, sort of a end your ability to do scientific research in some cases. We still, because no one wanted to touch this afterwards, we still don't really know today how well these organic semiconductors can perform. I mean, maybe at this point you can kind of step back into the field because a lot of the memories and hard feelings have faded. But it definitely hurt things, and it hurt people who, when you're trying to measure mobility of a semiconductor with a good crystal, the actual genuine measurements were not as good as Schoen's, and so had trouble making it through the literature in the same way. There's an interesting blog article by Doug Nadelson actually looking back at what people are using these kind of things for today. A lot of it is sort of, testing electrical transport through molecule kind of things. They're not using it as an organic, semiconductor to make a device, but there's a lot of fun fundamental physics you can study in these things. That's sort of how the field has morphed to, but it took 20 years to kind of get there. This one, I think, is my colleague Paul being a little rosy-eyed on things. None of the work could be reproduced and all the papers were retracted. So that's great. I don't feel as confident that this would happen today. I feel like there's enough paper mills in other countries that I might worry there would be fake reproductions. What I am disturbed by is, even though all these papers have been retracted, many of them are still cited today. It's like, did you read the paper? It has this big red notice on the top, and they're still citing it. So it's largely self-correcting. I would say when you look at this room temperature superconductor stuff, there are several groups in China that have reported that they are not able to reproduce it at all. There is one weird paper from UIC that says, hey, we saw some transitions at high temperatures, and then you look at their data in the supplementary and it looks like, no, that's a loose contact. Do you really believe it superconducted, then it not superconducted, then it superconducted, then it not superconducted, and then you just didn't show us that part of the curve in the paper. So those guys are going to have some real explaining to do. But largely, most of our understanding of things sorted itself out in terms of we know the stuff is nonsense. It just, if you were caught in the middle of things, it was not good. There's a question for me, and I should have put the slide a few slides earlier, which was, so when did Schoen start doing this? A little bit of why, what's driving him for this stuff. He has his PhD thesis, and he has a paper he published based on his PhD thesis. I think he was trying to do p-type doping of some chalcogenide semiconductor, and in order to show that the thing was successfully doped, you needed to get some nice luminescence peak at about that energy. So here in the publication, he has the necessary peak. Here in the PhD thesis, that peak is missing. Let's put the curves on top of each other and realize it is the same curve, except for adding a couple of peaks. So University of Constance could have taken action on this. They didn't. This, to them, was a careless mistake. And this is a common failure in investigations. If you narrow the scope of the investigation, so you only look at the one paper that the person complained about, and you don't look more broadly, you go, oh, it just happened once, it must be a careless mistake. I don't know how you carelessly move a couple of data points around. But if you realize that this was part of a pattern of conduct that went through 20 plus papers in his postdoc and staff scientist period, this was his MO. This is the same, duplicate curves with manipulations to get the phenomena that you need. He did throughout his career. That basically, as a grad student, one of the most important things you need to learn as a grad student is how to recover from failures. Because nature is a lot smarter than we are. It's certainly a lot smarter than your advisor is. So usually the thing your advisor tells you you're going to do at the start of your PhD doesn't work. And one of the things you have to figure out is how to recover from that and find something that does work. And Schoen never learned how to do that. He just found it was much easier to make up the result his advisor wanted and move on to the next thing. And so with people who commit misconduct, usually by the time you catch them, it's very unlikely it's the first time. And the lesson we should be learning from this, that if University of Rochester had understood this stuff, they would have dealt with things by now a long time ago, is that these are not isolated instances. Usually it's a pattern of behavior, and to look at things in isolation is a mistake because you miss the patterns. Okay. This was enough of a shockwave in the community. You can actually find a whole book written about this case in great detail. A lot of my students have grabbed the book just so that they can look in the index to look up various people. Right? I'm in there, Paul is in there, John Grazel is in there. But it's a very good documentation of the whole process in the committee. Here's a nice book review of the thing. There actually were several documentaries. BBC did one, Japanese public TV did one. There's a random YouTube one that's up now that seems not to know about all the previous ones. So it's well documented, and it's well documented because the report is public. So you actually can go through the report and understand all the things that were wrong. It actually changed how the American Physical Society set up guidelines for professional conduct. So when you go to their professional conduct guidelines, you can find the Schoen report in detail, but you can also find a lot of ways that they changed the standards for a whole bunch of things, including, authorship responsibility at physical review journals. The thing that's really useful, if you kind of would do a workshop on ethics, is there's a lovely book published by the National Academy, which is called On Being a Scientist. And it goes through in great detail, not just the ethical requirements, but a lot of case studies of difficult situations that you will find yourself in if you're unlucky, that are difficult and it's hard to make decisions about. They're not obviously clear-cut. Right? And so this is sort of an example. I'm not going to go through it because we're kind of running out of time, but sort of, being suggested that, hey, something went wrong with the experiment, maybe we should ditch a few data points, right? And when is it okay to do that and when is it not, right? And here's some discussion of the things that you would worry about there. So I'm mostly doing that as a recommendation for the book. Let me skip a few things. I talk often about pathological science. We're not going to have time to do that. It's a phrase, basically, that Irving Langmuir came up with, which is the cases where he would say there's no dishonesty involved, but people are fooling themselves. There's a very fine line between fooling yourself and fooling others. And in many cases, the fraud often starts with something like this and eventually crosses over into misconduct if you let it go long enough. But anyway, you can find the lecture. It's a wonderful read if you just Google Langmuir pathological science. Because he goes through a whole bunch of examples of weird things. Obviously, it's these are later ones, polywater and cold fusion. But he gave a very nice checklist of, and I'm not going to go through in great detail, other than to point out, when do people fool themselves is often when the effect you're looking for is really tiny. And some of the things are, close to the detectability limit. And then when people get into trouble is, if the magnitude of the effect is independent of your dependent variable, this is kind of a warning things are not going well. Usually, where you get into nutso land is when you start to get these claims of great accuracy given very, very noisy data and crazy theories made up to explain things ad hoc. So this is sort of discussion of kind of, trying to spot the nuttiness. A lot of, like the ivermectin research, some of it you could generously say falls into this category. Other bits, it's like much nastier. there's a lot of discussion of, what leads to fraud, and one of the things that it shows up again and again often is the group culture in the lab environment. If you're feeling like everyone else is taking shortcuts to get ahead, you're much more likely to feel okay and enabled to do that. Or even if you don't feel okay about it, you feel like that's the only way I get to survive. Everyone else is doing it, I got to do it as well. And certainly that's the excuse used by people often when they're caught. But you can kind of often look at groups where you notice a lot of people do bad things in that group. And it's like, how is it that this one person managed to hire so many different people who committed fraud? There's got to be something going on here in the group environment. Now, the misconduct is a civil offense. Usually the result of misconduct is you might get fired from your job. Not always. Sometimes you just get a slap on the wrist, depending which university you're at. You certainly will get prevented from applying for federal funding, usually for something like 3 to 5 years. So there are people who have been found guilty of misconduct, barred from federal funding, and amazingly 5 years later have NSF grants again. Here's an interesting example. Here is a retraction of an MRS proceeding, which takes quite a bit to think about that. What I want to point out is the authors are retracting the paper because their XPS spectrum is not their own data, but by some weird case is an exact duplicate of some of the data shown in another paper by some German guy in his PRL paper. And the authors are really sorry to the guy whose data they copied for the unfortunate error. The person responsible for this was a junior faculty member at SUNY Albany called Elaine Kalieros. SUNY Albany conducted a misconduct investigation and concluded this was just an honest error, no harm done, and let him continue on with things. And he went on to much bigger and better things. I don't know if you've heard of the Buffalo Billions, but he was convicted and spent 3 years in jail. He rose, in SUNY Albany, he rose to become the highest paid state employee in the state of New York. He brought in a whole bunch of semiconductor companies, got SRC funding channeled through his accounts in Albany. I had the misfortune to have SRC funding, and 1 year the state of New York told him he couldn't get an extra bonus to buy his car, and my $100,000 of annual funding just vanished that year, and he got his car. And I never got that money back. And after that, I'm like, I can't work with SRC anymore because I can't trust that the money is going to show up. Anyhow, he spent 3 years in jail. He's just been released. The university is in terrible financial shape because of all sorts of irregularities that happened because of this guy. He'd like his job back, and everyone else is laughing at that. But, the university could have stopped that in the beginning if they'd had the backbone to do it. Which brings us back to this case. What I want to highlight here is the New York Times article is not particularly useful. The Stanford student paper, this student reporter who, his dad in fact works for the New York Times, but he seems to be a much more effective reporter than his dad. He's less into access journalism, and so he's willing to say what's happened. This article makes a very interesting read, and it has all the relevant links to the report. It turns out the president, when he used to work at Genentech, and maybe even before that in academia, a lot of fake data in his papers. Everyone agrees he didn't fake the data. He was too busy. But you got to ask, how did he get people to do it? That they certainly felt that if they didn't do it that way, things would go badly for them. And so they would provide their boss with the things he expected. And that was enough that he stepped down. You can read this thing and you can read not quite between the lines, feeling that the report was maybe a little sugar-coated by Stanford as to what actually went on, but it was certainly enough to get rid of him. Okay, so you're probably wondering, okay, if there's something you're worried about in the literature, either because you looked at it and you're like, wait, what's going on? And you might want to know, how do I follow up? Is there something dodgy happening? Or you might want to report on it. There are actually a couple of interesting things to keep an eye on. Retraction Watch is a database and a website that keeps track of papers that get retracted and tries to look into them beyond the unhelpful retraction notice. Oh, we have these weird extra data points in our curve that got there accidentally. They fell off the back of a truck and into our paper, and now we're retracting the paper. So this digs into things in a lot more detail, particularly sometimes even things that are concerning before that. There's a great web plugin called PubPeer. So it was originally meant as an online journal club for people to discuss papers. And sometimes people do write in and say, hey, that was a great paper. But it has this little plugin that when you put it in your browser, and then I say, go to Google, and then I type into Google, Runga Dios Nature, every time a paper pops up, so it says, hey, here's one of the papers written by this guy on Google. Here's a paper on near ambient superconductivity. It puts a little line in that says, hey, there are 23 comments on this paper. And then you can click on the link and you can see 23 comments by people like Peter Armitage saying, hey, why are there all these duplicate curves and why is it wiggling like that? And sometimes the author will respond and provide very interesting explanations. And you can then look at that and go, really? But this is a helpful browser, helpful plugin to have on your browser as you read the literature. And you can go on that anonymously and make your own comments as well if you want. So at that point, I think I've run even later than I had planned, but let's maybe take a few questions.
So what's comments, questions?
Oh, go by all means.
I was just curious if you have any opinions on if you're concerned about people who are now learning from these mistakes and maybe getting smarter and better with their ways of manipulating data. Or I was also curious about areas of fraudulent data in areas that are maybe less high impact at the moment, but less incentive to sort of peer check.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So two things. Certainly, I would say our friend at Rochester is learning, but he's not learning very well. So, he got to publish a lot of stuff before he got caught. And he hasn't really been effectively caught properly yet. But there's certainly all the stuff he did when he didn't, before he realized how people would check for these things. So there's a long track record. The new stuff, he's tried to add noise to his data, but he's not very good at it. So he added perfectly Gaussian noise. And it's a perfect Gaussian. So you can look at that curve, and one of the people on this misconduct panel actually analyzed his data and said, look, you just added a perfect Gaussian to this thing. That's not okay. Hendrick Schoen, didn't really understand Poisson statistics. And so when he got called internally long before got caught externally, way he was flagged was he had statistics that didn't have enough fluctuations in them. and then he tried to produce a paper where he had added lots of statistics that he thought followed the statistics that it should have followed, and it was a Gaussian distribution, and first attempt didn't have enough fluctuations. Second one looked smoother, but it would have required an unphysical number of measurements to do it. And what he didn't understand was the statistics of dielectric breakdown follows a Weibull distribution. So it turns out, why do people duplicate curves? In many cases, it's because it's really hard to make realistic looking noise. That realistic noise is not pure Gaussian. It's really hard. Even if I'm trying to do a simulation to test my reconstruction algorithms for the tychography, it's very hard for me to get noise that looks like the noise we measure experimentally. So that's tough. It takes a long time. There are often people who are doing this are looking to take shortcuts. The other one that makes it harder to do this today than 20 years ago is the open science. If I can get the raw data that is in the file that came off the computer that recorded the IV curve as you were doing it, and it's their file in their file format, it's a lot harder to edit that, particularly if it's a big data set. And so the more of the raw data we have access to, and the more that, say, the manufacturers produce the data in a way that your original data set is something that can't be altered, right? So I would normally like, the thing that was easy a couple of years ago was I'd like all the students to write their data from the microscope to a CD-ROM so it can't be erased or altered. And then you've got a nice evidentiary chain if you ever need it. But the open data thing, and putting the open data on something like Zenodo where it can't be altered after it's put up means after your paper is published, even if it's in a low impact area, if there's a concern later on, you can certainly go back and look at the closest to raw data and see how they got from that raw data to their result, whether it was an honest error or whether there was something more nefarious. So not perfect, but it's better than we were. I don't know if that...
Yeah. You talked a lot about fabrication of data, which is very clearly wrong, but as you hinted, there's also a big gray area.
Yes.
And I just wonder whether you could address some of that gray area a little more. Like you have a hallway conversation with someone and get a great idea. I mean, can you talk about the gray area?
So I mean, the first one that you have to think about is the co-author responsibility bit. That if you're signing on to a paper, you need to declare what part of the paper you're responsible for, and you have to be willing to say, okay, if things went wrong, are you willing to take responsibility for that? And it turns out for that reason, journals are like, no, AI can't be a co-author on your paper because AI can't take responsibility for its actions, right? So signing up to be an author of the paper means, yes, you're taking credit if things go well, but if things go wrong, there's a part of the blame that you have to be willing to share. It's the part that you identified, right? So this is why, even if the journal doesn't require a statement of authorship, it's good to have one anyway, just so that people know who did what. For many reasons, right? I mean, in a group collaboration, someone made the samples, someone did the TEM, someone did the transport measurements. It's nice to know who did what anyway, but then if some part goes wrong, you kind of get an idea of those things. In general, if you had a good idea and it was a 5-minute discussion in a corridor, that's an acknowledgement in the paper. That's a thank you for giving us that great idea. That's not a, hey, you get to be on the paper for 5 minutes work, no matter how great the 5 minutes were. You ought to have, at the very least, you should have been helping to write the paper, which is, an exercise in of itself. When it comes to laboratory experiments, every field has maybe, some better than others. What are accepted practices, right? I had data that was recorded. If I'm throwing away data points out of that raw data, and I put my raw data on Zenodo so you can see the raw data. And then the raw data has a bunch of outliers to it. You kind of have an obligation, at least in the supplementary material, to explain why you threw away those outliers. And then people at least, can read the paper and say, do I believe there's reason for why these bad data points were thrown away? There was maybe a good reason. Oh, at this point, my friend walked into the room and opening the door messed up my magnetic field measurement. Or it's, oh, I have a loose contact. So there is one reproduction in quotes of the room temperature superconductor paper. And in the main part of the paper, they show, hey, there's this wonderful sharp transition. That's 1 pixel sharp, which is not what superconductors do. But when you look in the appendix, what you realize is, yep, it went high resistance, 0 resistance, and as it cooled down, back up to high resistance extremely sharply, 0 resistance, high resistance, 0 resistance. It's bouncing back up and down again multiple times. At that point, you look at that and go, okay, this is a loose contact on the sample. There's no superconductivity in here. These guys were idiots. Now, I don't know why they even put the paper up in archive after you see those results and why they didn't show that, but at least someone had the good sense to put it in the appendix, and I hope someone contacted this very senior person and said, you're an idiot, take this down.
Okay, I think we should now go to the break and continue my conversation during the break. Okay, thank you very much. What you need to